On New Year's, 150 years ago, Frank Oates reached Victoria Falls. This has been something that he'd been striving towards since he reached the African continent in March 1873. And now the year had turned 1875. He had made it, but at what cost? Frank Oates and his companions are often quoted as the first Europeans to see the falls in full flood, as explorers before them, like Livingstone, had gone during the dry season. But there was a good reason for this: fever. Frank kept a diary of his travels around southern Africa, and there are many references to what was often described as Zambezi fever. At the same time, King Lobengula, monarch of the Ndebele people, was also worried about the fever. The sudden rise in European travellers passing through his nation to visit the falls, and those passers through relying on his subjects as guides and servants, had led to a rise in the fever. He was not only conscious of the safety of his own subjects, but aware of the diplomatic implications of all these white European men dying of fever en route to or from the Zambezi River. Lobengula even tried to forcibly stop wagons heading towards the Zambezi by placing his indunas at certain points to deter travellers from going to the falls. This affected Frank Oates, who was stopped, and he had to get permission from the king to get to the falls. So Frank was aware of the risk to his own health, but he was also aware that as a white European traveller to this area, he had a certain amount of privilege. So he would often sleep in a wagon, just like the replica behind me. So he was off of the ground, he was dry, he was warm or cool depending on what he needed, but he also had some protection from insects, whereas his servants, who were predominantly Ndebele people, were having to sleep on the ground and were just more exposed to the elements. And this is something that he did factor into his decisions about when he should go to the falls. I hardly think, however, that I shall do so. That is, go to the falls, as the season is so far advanced. I am principally afraid for my boys, who are far more likely to suffer than a white man is, who has a snug, dry bed to lie on and other comforts, and I distrust my old wagon, which has played me false more than once already. So what is this fever? Very likely the illness that we're talking about we know as malaria. Malaria is caused by being bitten by an infected mosquito. It has an incubation period of a couple of weeks, and then the person will begin to feel unwell with a fever, headaches, drowsiness, stomach issues, loss of appetite, muscle pain, and a yellowing of the skin and eyes, as well as a difficulty breathing. Without treatment, it can be fatal very quickly. It's clear from Frank's journals that he was so aware of the fever. It's littered throughout his 2-year expedition. We hear about far away cases of Zambezi fever that he's heard through the grapevine. Whenever he gets into a town, he writes about hearing about people who are either convalescing, having recovered from Zambezi fever, or maybe people that have passed away, people's servants that have been affected by the fever. And he also notes about King Lobengula's concerns and anxieties around the rise of this fever. So it's something that's very much in his mind, very much on the table when considering his expedition. So where did he go? Victoria Falls was always the aim of Frank's expedition. He arrived in Durban in March 1873 with his younger brother William. The plan was to see the country as he travelled northwards towards the falls. However, they didn't make it in time the first year, and rather than going when it wasn't safe, they waited. By this point, which was when they realised that it was too late to go ahead. It was the end of August, and William had decided that he would rather go home than wait a full year to have another go. He had Frank's word that Frank would not try and reach the falls by himself. In our collection, and currently on display as part of our Reaching the Falls expedition, we have a very stern letter from William to his brother Frank, who is upset to hear from a friend that Frank is still planning on reaching the falls that year. So very soon after William has left. In fact, William is still in Africa. He hasn't set sail yet. Luckily for William, Frank didn't make it that first year. Instead, he spent rainy season, so this is the sort of November, December, January, February, March, April, visiting the court of Lobengula, experiencing the culture of the people there, and as well as meeting other Europeans out in the veldt for either the purposes of meeting interesting people and recording their experiences, exploring, and also hunting. Once the rains had stopped in the late spring of 1874, Frank was really keen to get going, but he just experienced setback after setback after setback. And by the time it was the sort of early autumn of 1874, he was beginning to worry that once again he had run out of time. In fact, there is a moment in Frank's diary when it seems that he has reconciled himself to having to go home without seeing the falls. He writes, "The fates seems to have conspired against my reaching that river. I think I shall now give up the Zambezi altogether, consoling myself with this adage, 'tis not in mortals to command success." Frank knew that setting off from where he was at this time, which was October, he was risking getting to the falls at the peak of the fever season. That October, he met Stoffel Kennedy and a Mr. Dorhill, two Europeans who Frank Oates knew and trusted. They tell Frank that they are planning an expedition to the Zambezi. At first, Frank is concerned about the risk of such a journey so late in the year, but they assure him that the plan is only to go halfway and then wait until April to make that final push towards the river. Frank decided that a change of scenery is just what he needed, and on the 3rd of November 1874, he set off once again in his wagon towards the falls. By December, Frank Oates is tantalisingly near to the falls. This is the closest he's ever been, and he is at this point still going ahead with the plan that had been set the month or so before, that they would get as close as they could to the falls, wait out the rainy season, then push that final last bit in the spring. Then Frank meets two English traders who are coming back from the Zambezi, and they tell him exactly what Frank wants to hear. Things have turned out that I think I am choosing the best course in going on now. In the first place, I have here met wagons from the Zambezi, those of Wood and Sellis, two Englishmen who hunt and know the country well. They both advise me to go at once. They say they would rather go on now than stand all the time and then go in April. In fact, it seems that April is too early, and all agree that it is infinitely better to go now that the rains are falling than it is to go too soon after they have ceased to fall. They say the risk of fever is not so great as long as the rain falls. So it's decided. Frank is going now, in December. He puts together a team out of the people that are with him and reports that the majority of his African servants want to go with him to see the falls. It's whilst he's on the road that he also employs a guide called John McKenna that is also from Southern Africa. It's at this point that Frank puts together the last two members of his team. They are George Westbeach, who was a trader, and Dr. Benjamin Bradshaw. Now, Frank is delighted that these two will be joining him, particularly Bradshaw, and he writes home in a lot of excitement, not only because he's about to do the thing that he's been here at this point for almost 2 years to do, reach the falls, but he's doing it with a medical professional at his side, and I think that relieves some of his anxiety over the risk of fever by going in December. They're all ready, they've got everybody at their side. Now it's just time to go. So we know that Frank Oates reaches the falls at New Year's, but what happens after? His recording in January is sparse, which is not unusual for Frank. He goes in and out of how often he writes in his journal. We have a couple of recordings throughout January, but one of the only really notable things to comment is that by the middle of January, two of Frank's servants, who unfortunately we don't know their names or their fates, were at that point ill with fever. And on the 25th of January, we hear that Frank has a headache, which obviously is a symptom of many things, but it is one of the symptoms of malaria. He brushes it off, he doesn't feel that unwell, he's able to go about his day, he's able to hunt, he doesn't think too much of it. But then we don't hear from him for a very long time. So on the 5th of February 1875, the story picks up, but it's not Frank's words now, it's the words of those around him. We know that between the initial headache that started on the 25th, that Frank's condition had got steadily worse. He had malaria. On the 5th of February, it was felt by Dr. Bradshaw that Frank was improving, which was very good news. And it was decided that most likely Frank would be okay, and really now that their main objective was to get to a point of the trail where they will be able to get some medical supplies, medical help, and somewhere more comfortable for Frank to rest. So they needed to crack on and get to Tatey. At one point on this day, on the 5th of February, they decide to pause. Dr. Bradshaw thinks it's important that they give Frank the chance to rest, not be jolted around in the wagon, to have some soup and some brandy, and to have a bit of a sleep. They haven't stopped in a particularly good spot. There's no water around, and they are about as remote as they could possibly be, but Dr. Bradshaw thinks it's important. So they stop. Frank has some soup, some brandy. He is told to rest. Dr. Bradshaw leaves Frank alone for a little bit to go see to other business, and Frank is attended by two African servants who have been lent to Frank by Mr. Westbeach because they are able to speak English. And it's these servants who then very shortly afterwards rush to find Dr. Bradshaw because Frank's condition has suddenly taken a very sharp turn for the worst. And so Bradshaw rushes to Frank and finds him dying. And here I have Frank's brother Charles, so his other brothers Charles, describing the scene through the accounts of Bradshaw and Westbeach and the people who were there. So Charles Oates describes it as Frank Oates tried to speak, but in so low a whisper that the other unhappily failed to catch his meaning, and a few minutes afterwards, about a quarter of an hour before sunset, the brave spirit sank peacefully. Frank Oates was only just a couple of months shy of 35 when he died. He was a young man. Obviously they were in this really rural and quite barren spot. They knew they needed to bury Frank Oates out where they were, but found that the ground was too hard to dig. So they sent a messenger out to somebody else that Frank knew and talks about in his diaries, a man called Pete Jacobs, and Jacobs sends word that there is he recommends a place that they could bury him. It was a disused game trap that was about 8 foot deep near a road near a small stream, and that is where Frank Oates is still buried today. How do we know all about this? Well, the people around Frank Oates really came together to make sure that all of Frank's belongings, his letters, his journals, his things that he had collected were all safely put together and sent back to his home in Leeds. Interestingly, his William, the one that initially came with Frank to Southern Africa to see the falls, was actually on his way back towards Africa when he heard the news of his brother's death. And as he was assured that all of Frank's affairs were in order thanks to Frank's friends within the African continent, William felt it was best, rather than stay in Africa, he basically turned around and headed straight back to Leeds to be with his family. This obviously was in 1875, 150 years ago. A few years later, about a decade later, the book Matabele Land and Victoria was published by Frank Oates using his diaries and his letters, but edited by his brother Charles Oates. And in our exhibition downstairs you can see the research that both Charles and William were involved in to try and understand Frank's drawings, his explanations of plants and animals that he saw. Charles sent them to experts around the country to get their opinion. He edited the publication and was responsible for it becoming published in 1881. And then Frank's collection ended up here in Selborne thanks to the Oates families 70 years ago when the museum came into being. If this story has interested you, and I hope it has, please do visit the Frank Oates Gallery here. It's here all the time, and it tells the story of Frank Oates from his wild childhood sketching animals and birds in Leeds to his time in Southern and Central America, and then finally his expedition in Southern Africa. And until the 30th of March, you can see our template on Reaching the Falls, Frank Oates' last expedition, which is here to celebrate Frank's life and to mark the 150th anniversary, both of him reaching the falls and of his untimely death.